Let's explore Maya's animation preferences. Now before any keyframe is set, I want you to go through and just check their preferences just to make sure that every setting is good to go according to their project requirements. If this is not done, you might find that some work will have to be redone. You might find that your frames might shift, or if you're working with special connections, again, if your preferences aren't set for those types of connections, again, you might find that working inside of Maya will not be as intuitive as you'd like. So it really depends on the settings you would like to work with. So let's go ahead and take a look at these preferences. We'll head over to the window menu. We can access them from here, settings and preferences, right at the top. Or another way is to access them from the bottom right of Maya, right next to our auto key icon. So if we were to go ahead and click here, notice that will send us right to our timeline settings. Now before we take a look at these, let's go ahead and start from the top. We'll go to settings, and here we'll find our time drop down. This is where we set our frame rate. You can choose whatever we'd like here. Typically you'll work with film 24 frames per second, or if you're working in games, you can go ahead and set this to 30 frames per second NTSC. But again, you have several other choices you can work with. Now it's very important to set this early on before, again, a keyframe is set, because you'll find that if this is not done, your keyframes will shift if you're switching between frame rates. Just to show you this, if we were to go to our character set drop down, let's go ahead and click on this arrow here and then select CS Woman, character set Woman 01. Now again, we'll get into character sets, but what we see here are all keyframes that make up this animation. So they've been tied to one node just to manage the animation a lot easier and to create animations faster. But going back to our preferences, let's take a look at what happens if we switch our frame rate from 24 frames per second to 30. You'll see that our timeline has adjusted. As we scrub through, you can see that every keyframe isn't necessarily on an integer frame as it once was. Now they're on subframes. So this is not good, because sometimes we have to go in and edit animation, and if it's not on the frame it needs to be on because we accidentally forgot to set our frame rate, well, then you can see how big of an issue this can be to fix. There are ways to adjust the keyframes on the timeline, and we'll take a look at more timeline control we have. But before we get to that, I'd like to show you this really cool option here, keep keys at current frames. I'm just going to go ahead and switch this back to 24 frames per second. You can see this is the frame rate the animation was created in, but let's say if we needed to switch this to 30 frames per second without adjusting the keyframes here, their placement. You can go ahead and turn on this option, keep keys at current frames, and now when we switch this to 30 frames per second, yes, the frame rate has changed. However, every keyframe is still on the frame it needs to be on. So now the animation plays back at 30 frames per second, yes, but every key is still on the frame it was created on. Alright, so if you do find that you need to go in and adjust your frame rate, and you've already started to animate, make sure that this option is on. Okay, so what we have next is animation. Let's go ahead and take a look at that. At the top we have our auto key settings, so we can go ahead and enable auto key from here. If we're working with character sets, notice we have settings here. It's why they're make sure an individual channel is keyed, or we can key all attributes. So the first option, the option we have by default, is the cleaner choice. If we were to go ahead and show one of the character's controls, I'll just go ahead and go back to the show menu and turn on NURBS curves. We can go ahead and select the C, which is the character center. If we were to select that, you can see that as we scrub through, the values change. Now let's say if we wanted to just record a change with auto key in one axis, let's say the forward axis, the Z. Well, with this first choice, only the Z axis will receive a keyframe. Again, this is a lot cleaner than the second choice, which would cause every animatable channel to receive a keyframe. Now, if the first option is cleaner, why would we want to work with the second choice? Well, a lot of times when you're blocking in your animations, you want that entire pose to be saved so that when you are ready to switch to smooth mode, to smooth the interpolation, it's a lot easier to tweak the animation because, again, that pose that you've spent so long blocking in has been saved because all keyframes have been locked down by this auto key system. Alright, so you just want to find out what's going to be best for you. If you just want to work with channels individually, you can go ahead and use this first choice. If you like to lock down all poses during your blocking pass, you could use the second choice. Now, there are, of course, ways we can still animate with the first option and the second option simultaneously. We'll take a closer look at that as we progress, but just wanted to go ahead and show you these options. Now, underneath, we have rotation modes. By default, you can see we're working with independent Euler. We will spend a lesson on the two different rotation modes we have. You can see there's Euler and then there's Quaternion. Euler, with this option, we tend to run into gimbal lock. That's when two rotation rings overlap and we lose control in one axis. And that can cause animations to kind of flip. However, with Quaternion, this was invented so that we can avoid gimbal lock issues. So again, these two systems, they deserve a lesson, so we'll go ahead and save that for a lesson to come. I'm going to go ahead and make sure that this is brought back to independent Euler, the default. And then if we're working with human IK, again, we have settings here to choose what type of rotation mode we'd like to use. Now, when we are ready to animate, again, before any keyframe is set, you can see we have tangent or interpolation types here. So this is how the animation will turn out when we create a keyframe. If we wanted to create a linear animation, something very robotic, we can most certainly do so. If we want to create something more organic, we could use spline, clamped, flat, plateau, pretty much everything else. If you're blocking in your animations, you'd stick with linear and you'd also stick with stepped. You can see that stepped is only accessed as an out tangent. Cannot use step mode for our in tangent choice. If you'd like to learn more about these settings, feel free to take a look at animation polishing techniques. You'd also take a look at our walk cycle series. Just kind of shows you how to work between these different settings so that you can animate with the interpolation you need. Alright, so I'll go ahead and make sure that this is brought back to auto. Auto is more of a newer feature inside of Maya, and it essentially it looks at the keyframe before to determine what the interpolation should be. So if your keyframe before is set to linear, the keys that follow will also be set to linear. So it's a way of animating faster. And then underneath that we have animation blending. So if you are working with constraints or other connections, you'll want to work with this default choice, because this allows you to not only set keyframes but then work with connections that might be on top of those keyframes. Now the second choice is a way to work with other connections that are not constraints and keyframes. So a pair blend node is created to blend between those connections and your keyframes. But again, this does not work with constraints. And the last option, it kind of separates your keyframes and any other connections. So again, typically you'll stick with this first choice because it's more versatile. You can go in and work more freely with this choice. Then we have some graph editor tools for snapping values, or working with the left mouse button to alter certain selections. We have those choices here. The camera sequencer, if you'd like to learn more about it, feel free to take a look at a set of individual lessons where we go through some new features in Maya, and one was the camera sequencer, updates made to that system. Really cool because we can create a series of camera shots without having to use any other third-party app. We can do so right here in Maya to record camera cuts and then create an output to kind of take a look at those camera cuts before we're ready to actually send our renders off to a compositing application to kind of finalize shots. So it's a way to save time. And then we can work with referenced animation curves, which is great. We weren't able to do that in the past, but now if an animation has been referenced and you still need to go in and tweak the animation, you can go ahead and turn on this option. And now if the animation again is referenced, you're still allowed to go ahead and tweak it, which is very nice. Thank you, Autodesk, for adding that. We'll take a look at this option a little bit later on as well. Alright, so we've looked at settings, animation, and now we come to timeline. So what I'd like to do is stop the lesson here, and in the next lesson we'll go ahead and finish up our preferences by taking a look at these settings.